So, yesterday, the official Twitter account of Valorant, the video game, tweeted out an image of two of their female characters, Killjoy and Raze, kissing, thus confirming them as a canonical romance. Now, as an Overwatch creator, I tweeted in response to this that Overwatch needed to step up because representation matters, and it was not an issue I wanted to see the game hide on, which in turn got a lot of negative responses from people in my replies and even some random messages that I got, telling me that none of it really mattered and that it was another case of shoving politics into video games. So I figured it was worthwhile to just elaborate on that issue and speak on why I believe representation matters and why I stand by that statement. And hopefully I can explain to you from a personal POV where that sentiment comes from and why it's important. And do forgive me if I'm a little bit nasally right now, I'm just recovering from a cold. So I think the first thing to acknowledge is that to some extent we all like to see things that we can relate to in the media we consume. Whether that's the films we watch, the TV shows we see, or the video games we play. Not every single thing we watch has to be relatable, but to some extent we need to be able to empathize with what we're watching and reflect on it through our own experiences. So take a sitcom like Friends, for example, which is maybe the most popular TV show of all time. One of the reasons why the show is so popular is because you can look at all of the main characters and relate to them in one way or the other. People watch every episode and they come away feeling like, oh well, I'm a bit like Phoebe, my friend is a bit like Monica, this guy is a bit like Joey, he's a bit like Ross. Each of the characters has various personality types that we can relate to, both from our own experiences, but from that of people we know. If we weren't able to empathize with any of the characters, that being if we couldn't put ourselves in any of their shoes, we'd never find any of the scenarios they put themselves in very funny. It's the familiarity that makes it such a popular and cozy show to watch. Now, not everything we watch has to be fully relatable. I certainly have never been transported to a galaxy far, far away, but I still enjoy the Star Wars franchise. But the same principle applies to things like video games as well. Some people like the character Reina just because of how she looks and what her background is. Some play a character like Genji because they think the idea of being a cyborg ninja is very cool. And it is. And other people will pick characters just because they think they're the best character to play, or it'll give them the strongest advantage in the game. But the ability to see some version of yourself reflected back in the media you consume is a basic human desire. And whether it's consciously important to you or not, I'm sure you can understand that for some people more than others, it is important. And this is where we get to the issue of representation. Now, rather than explain this with vague theory, I'd like to give you an example that comes from my own experiences. So a little bit about me. I was actually born in India, and I moved to the United Kingdom, where I currently live now, when I was about 11. So I've now lived here in the UK for almost 2 decades. From the age of 11 onwards, I've been consuming, entirely Western media, and it became my normal, as you would expect. And something like representation isn't something you necessarily think about consciously, but it was only about when I was in my early 20s that I watched for the first time a show that spoke to one of my experiences specifically. And this was a show called Master of None. To give a quick summary, Master of None is a show created by Aziz Ansari, who's an American comedian with Indian parents. In the second episode of Master of None, Aziz's character Dev and his best friend Brian, who is of Taiwanese descent, are having a conversation and are essentially bitching about how annoying their parents are, asking them to fix their iPads or set up their schedule properly on their phone, which I'm sure all of us can relate to because whose parents aren't bad with technology. But as they're talking and they're sharing stories about their parents, they start to realize how hard their parents' lives were growing up. They decide to bring both sets of parents together for dinner, and as they exchange stories, their parents tell them about their early lives in the countries that they came from. Both parents had an incredibly difficult transition, moving to a foreign country where they knew very few people and had to experience various forms of discrimination.
Mom, what about your first day in America? That must have been pretty exciting.
No, I just got dropped off from the airport and your father went to work. I didn't know nobody and I barely knew your father.
Well, what about that first day, though? Did you go out and explore the city?
No, I sat in the couch and cried.
And as Dev and Brian talked, they realized how much easier their lives were than their immigrant parents, who had to cross not only a generational but a cultural gap and overcome many hurdles to give their children the privileges that they never had. Now, it's not an experience unique to immigrants to have to work hard to provide for their children, but watching the show, it was the first time in my life that I'd ever seen a piece of Western media that spoke about one of my experiences, that being of a second-generation immigrant. And of course, it made me reflect on my own life and my own experiences. It made me think about my family and the times that my parents grew up in, and the stories my father used to tell about growing up at a time when his favorite treat, which could be bought on a street vendor, cost what would be the equivalent of a few pennies, and yet his family still couldn't afford that. Or my mother, who went to university at a time when she was only one of 3 women in her entire year. And reflecting back off the show, I was able to gain a bit more perspective on my own life and the privileges that I've been afforded. Now, of course, these are conclusions I could have come to on my own, and through some other show as well, which featured white people. But it was so much more direct and it was so much more profound for me coming from a show which spoke directly to my experiences. And I had realized in that moment that I had spent my entire teen and adult life, normalizing the experiences of my friends, but not those of my own. I kind of took for granted watching and hearing stories of people born in the same country as their parents, of people who had generations of their family living in the same vicinity, of people who always shared the same culture with that of the land they were living in. And that is valuable. I do want to surround myself with those stories, but it was also important for me to see my own experiences reflected back by someone else, and to see that as normal too. And for perhaps other people to be able to see that story and understand my experiences indirectly, without me always having to tell them about it. For them to gain some insight into people like me, the way I had spent my life gaining insight about people like my friends. So when people talk about being seen or being represented, this is what they mean. And this is where we come back to that idea of representation even in your video games. For many people watching, you may not consider this an important issue. You may not see it as valuable to see yourself reflected back in the video games you play. You might say you play precisely for the opposite reasons, as an escapism, to play something that is different from your life. But I would guess that there's a high likelihood that if you do feel that way, you probably have a lot of media that already speaks to who you are and your own experiences. That you've watched plenty of shows or films or games that have already reflected back on your life and shown you a version of yourself, something that you can use to color your understanding of the world. But for a lot of people, for example, people in the LGBTQ+ community, those things are still a rarity. Take, for example, Marvel movies. God knows how many of these suckers have been churned out over the last decade or so. There is like dozens of these sons of bitches around, and yet none of those superhero flicks that you love have a single queer character as the main protagonist. Now, I'm not talking some spin-off show or some side character in the fringes, I mean front and center. Now again, you might say, why is it important? Why is it important that they should be queer? And why should that be important to the film? And the thing is, it doesn't have to be the main plot of the film, but consider the usual pattern of how these films go. There's a main superhero, usually a man, who discovers his superpowers, falls in love with a beautiful girl, struggles with both understanding his powers and pursuing this woman, fights the forces of evil, and eventually overcomes all his struggles to save both the world and his relationship with this woman that he loves. The relationship might not be core to the film, but it's almost always there. That is representation. That is normalization. We don't even think about it because we assume that's what's going to happen. And if the idea is that we don't need queer people shoved in our face because it would be a cheap and hollow PR stunt, and I agree with you, most of the time these companies are only doing this for cheap and hollow PR stunts. But even if we try and stick to a realistic version of the world and avoid tokenism, gay people are real. I know, breaking news. Queer people are real, trans people are real. And by sheer order of probability, we should have seen one of these characters be gay or non-binary or trans at some point. But they never are. Because despite whatever people might think about it being normalized and it being fine and it not needing to be shoved in our face because that will be better, so many of these companies actively shy away from a decision like that because there are still so many places around the world and so many people around the world who simply do not accept the existence of LGBTQ+ people. And that in turn has damaging consequences for people who may not be being persecuted actively. They may live in a country with progressive rights that you feel put them on par with any other human being, which is still often not the case. But at the core and fundamental level, they are denied what the rest of us take for granted. The ability to watch the things you love and see yourself be normalized, to see yourself be reflected back in the things that you consume. And when these big films or these big video games actively shy away from providing that representation, they make people of these backgrounds feel ashamed. They make them feel like what they are must be hidden as well. Or they become like me, where they live their lives not understanding that this was even a possibility to be reflected back in the things you love. To take for granted that you will always watch someone else's experiences, never your own. And again, it may not seem like much right now if those are things you take for granted, but I promise you it's exhausting, and it chips away at your ability to enjoy things even in the littlest of ways. If you're a gay man, for example, how likely is it that if you played an RPG game and you had a bunch of romance options, that you'd ever get a homosexual pairing as an option to you? It's usually a rarity. Usually you'd have to follow heterosexual romances. And again, it may not seem like a lot, but try reversing the situation. If you're a straight person listening, imagining every video game you played and that female character you thought was charming or attractive is never given to you as an option to romance, even if you're given 10 other options that are all men. It probably won't ruin your enjoyment of the game. If the gameplay is good, you're still probably going to love it, but it would be a minor source of frustration. And when everything you consume provides you with these minor sources of frustration, you often start to feel disconnected with the things that you're consuming. And so we come back again to that issue with Overwatch, and why I asked that the devs do more for open representation. Yes, Overwatch has canonically gay characters. Yes, their poster child Tracer is a lesbian. But all significant indicators of that are buried deep somewhere in the comics, or on the fringes of the game's lore, or even their social media presence. And they don't have to be. If they were truly normalized, you would just see more of them. How often do you see Reinhardt flirt with Ana, or Bab flirt with just about every female character in the game? But do you ever see Soldier do that with any of the male characters in the game? Or Tracer with any of the female characters in the game? Of course not, because that would make a set of people very uncomfortable. And with a game like Overwatch, the biggest considerations are often foreign markets, like China for example, where Overwatch performs very, very well, and for which market Overwatch clearly wants to avoid creating any controversy. But see, that's where we get to a bit of a gotcha moment, because we can't claim that queer representation is normalized and simultaneously justify why more of it doesn't exist because foreign markets would be upset by it. Because if they were truly normalized, there would be nothing to be upset about. And when games like Overwatch and when companies like Activision Blizzard try to market that they are diverse and inclusive games, those slogans become hollow when they don't include this kind of representation. When the only reference to Trace's identity is buried in a comic somewhere 6 years ago. When the only 2 sprays that even hint at Soldier and Tracer's sexuality were only acquirable for a limited time and are now gone for most people to be able to acquire. Because at the end of the day, these companies will prioritize their profits more often than they prioritize their people. But that is why it is commendable that Valorant tweeted out the image they did. And even if it was a cheap PR stunt, even if they only did it for internet likes, it is still no less valuable, because it still contributes to normalizing something important. That for someone playing the game who is queer, that they are able to look at the things they love and say that is some version of me being reflected back. That the things I love, the things I feel, can be expressed in the video games that I enjoy. And it's just crazy to me that being a cyborg ninja is more of an attainable aspiration in Overwatch than it is to just see a gay pairing openly shown or discussed on screen. It's one of those paradoxes. It would not have to be a big deal if it was done, but it's not done, and so it has to be a big deal. And so we have to make a bit of an outcry, and we have to put pressure on Blizzard, because this is one area where the pressure will tell. Their entire reason for avoiding gestures like this, for avoiding any meaningful queer representation, the way Apex has done, the way Valorant has done, even down to the fact that it won't name their pride icon Pride and will name it Rainbow instead. All these things are an attempt to manage their PR, to make sure that they don't cause any stir in any spheres that would be upset by it. Well, if not doing it causes even more of a stir, then they're gonna have to do something about it. And that's why it's important to raise a bit of a fuss when games like Overwatch are negligent on this front. Because they're not just letting themselves down, but they're letting entire sections of their player base down by essentially contributing to what would be erasure. To make these people who love their game feel like who they are cannot be accepted in the world that's been presented. To feel like talking monkeys are a more realistic outcome of the future world than openly LGBTQ+ humans. And it cannot be buried on the fringes like it is with Tracer. Because if it is, then you're admitting that there's some problem with it. And if you have a problem with it, if your argument is that why does it matter, then I'll simply turn the question back to you. Why does it matter to you if they are gay? If it's such a non-issue to you, and it clearly is important to other people, then why should it matter to you if some of the characters are queer? You surely are unaffected by this decision, and surely it will not alter your consumption of the game in any significant way. The only exception to that is if on some level them being queer stops you relating to them, or changes how you view them. And if that's the case, then you've now gotten an insight into what people from a minority background experience all day, every day, which is that they quite happily normalize the experience of others for themselves, and maybe it's about time that you normalize their experience for yourself for once. And that pretty much sums up what I've got to say on that issue.